Hi, I'm Scott Flanagan. I'm the owner of Fourth and Main Designs. I've lived in Fremont now for over 20 years, but I originally grew up in Colorado, where my parents live. I came to Fremont in 2003 for college at Midland University. It was Midland Lutheran College at that point, now Midland University. While I was there, I took a part-time job at Country Tradition so I could make some graduation quilts for friends and save money on fabric. And from there, I ended up working for the store for almost 17 years and also kickstarted my design company, Fourth and Main Designs, as a pattern company, which now has expanded to not only patterns, but also books, fabric, and more stuff coming in the future. I learned to sew at the age of 7 from my maternal grandmother, Wilma Ropty. My grandparents lived on a farm in northeast Nebraska, and after I was born, they sold the farm and moved to Colorado and were my daycare. Mom's parents watched me 4 days a week, and Dad's parents watched me 1 day a week. But Grandma Ropty loved to quilt, and that's where I got the inspiration. So Grandma taught me the basics of sewing. She taught me the basics, how to sew a straight seam, how to press a seam, very basic. Grandma did strictly utilitarian sewing. But in high school, I did a quilt for a retiring choir director that was really loved by the students, by faculty, and people in the district. And I was a big quilt. It was 144 inches square. I was working with a Bernina dealer in the area who I was friends with. And they're like, you need to learn how to bind a quilt. And you need to learn how to machine quilt and not tie it and just turn it, what they call birthing, where you turn the quilt from right sides together out and finish the edge. And then also working at the quilt store, Kevin and Leslie Main inspired me to go more in the industry when they hired me full time, and things just kind of expanded from there. So as I said, I started the store in 2007. And then in 2011, I decided, I was bored one day. I'm like, well, if I'm going to sit at home sewing, I might as well make some money. So I designed my first 2 patterns, Charming Geese and Charming Christmas Tree. And I sold them at the store. And I mean, I'm like, if I make a couple $100s a year selling patterns, that's fun money. That is slush that just kind of can go to going out to the movies, going out for dinner. It was never a goal or plan to be where I'm at today. After about a year or 2, I decided I wanted to apply to a magazine. I got turned down a number of times. And finally, I got an email one day from Quiltmaker, and they said, the editor goes, "Hi, Scott, I've been following you. I know we've turned you down sometimes, but it's time to finally be in a magazine. We're doing an issue on male quilters. I need a submission." So I submitted. I got Chop Suey was the pattern that got accepted using a jelly roll and a charm pack. And from there, I ended up started getting in a magazine every single issue. And once I got into Quiltmaker, their partner companies were Fons and Porter, McCall. So then I was not only in one magazine, I was in 3 magazines. And that kind of just became every issue, I had something in it. Then that was in 2014. In 2020, I got contacted by Northcott and Banyan Batiks to do a block of the month. After I got the phone discussing that project, about 5 minutes later, they called me back and said, we want you to design a fabric collection. And the same day that I got the fabric collection and sold the block of the month, my editor from Quiltmaker had moved to Quilter's World magazine. She called me that same morning and says, "I'm in a new magazine. I want a submission by Friday for my first issue. And I think you should write a book, and you need a book submission by next Monday." So in one day, I got a book offer. I sold a block of the month and a fabric collection. That was a pretty epic day during 2020 that I remember. And I did celebrate with a margarita at 11 o'clock in the morning because I thought it was well-deserved. And from there, it just exploded. I've book 4 is out currently. Book 5 is coming out next year. I'm working on fabric collections 4, 5, 6 currently. So in December 31st of 2023, I resigned my full-time position at Nebraska Quilt Company. And now I travel the U.S. Doing speaking engagements for shops, guilds, whoever wants to hire me, vending quilt shows. Last year, I did 37,000 miles and did over 35 states. This was never a career goal. This was never the plan. So this literally just happened, and every opportunity I had, I just jumped at it. So when I got to one magazine and they sent me a call for another magazine, I submitted. So I have to give a lot of my credit to the magazines. So if you want to get in the industry, submit to magazines. It's not the normal way to do it. But that's how I did it, was through the magazines. And then once I got to one, it was 1 to 2. And then when they call and ask you to offer you options, I just said yes. Well, I'd love to say, but a lot of it's undercover. I am working on another book. I'm coming out in 2025. I'm working on fabric collections that'll be shown, 2 collections for September announcement of this year, and 3 collections for announcement in various parts of 2026. And then I've got a couple pretty exciting block of the months coming up as well. Yeah, as everyone knows, it's kind of a joke that I can get a quilt done in a day, or like I'll take fabric home on Friday and come back the next day with the top completed. And part of it is, in my studio, I've got a clock that sits on the opposite end of the room. And I'll make 1 unit for a block. And I'll say, okay, that took me 3 minutes to make that block. Okay, I need to make 30 blocks. Okay, that's 90 minutes. Can I do it in 80 minutes? And the whole time I'm sewing, I'm watching the clock to see if I can beat my goal. And then I get that block done and be like, well, I got done 80 minutes. Well, I can probably get this next section done in another half hour. Oh, I got done 20 minutes. Oh, can I get the next? And that's how I work through meals and stuff, is I get so adrenaline pushed by watching the clock and beating the clock that I then don't want to break rule, because it's like, I've got this momentum going, and that's why I get a quilt done in a day and a half. I will sew from 7 a.m. till 10 o'clock at night, and basically just nonstop. But I do usually have either an audiobook or TV going on, not really to watch. The TV sits actually to my right. So the only way I can watch TV is if I go like that, but I can see kind of out of my peripheral, and I'll just pick something that I know, like A Diagnosed Murder, Murder, She Wrote, Big Bang Theory, something that I know the storyline, but I don't have to think. I can just really just focus on, what am I doing? Sometimes I will get the inspiration from the project, and the project will dictate the fabric choices. Other times I'll see the fabric and I'll think, oh, I've got the perfect quilt idea based on the fabric. So it can go both directions. I'm going to use the moose quilt, Moose Bee Quilting, for example. In the case of that, when I knew I wanted a moose quilt, a sampler moose quilt. And as soon as I started designing, I'm like, this has to be made with Woolies flannel. There was nothing else that it just had to be in my mind. But like Illusions, I saw the fabric and the design came from, inspired by the fabric. So it can go both directions. I don't have a necessarily set way I design or get inspiration. A lot of times my inspiration is last minute induced panic, when I'm like, oh, I have a submission due or a quilt due in 2 weeks and I forgot about it. And it's amazing what you can design on the last minute. One of the magazines, actually, a year or 2 ago, I had actually chose not to submit because I had a really packed schedule. And the day after the submission was in, I got an email. Where's your submission? You have 2 days to get a submission in. Fine, I'll do a submission. So I just really did not put my best effort in. I just kind of winged like 4 design options. Get an email back the next day. We accepted 2 of them. I'm like, I did not submit because I didn't have time. And then you picked 2? It's the story behind the quilt. And even though a lot of mine are from magazines, there's usually some sort of story that goes with the quilt. The ones behind me, the stories about my voice disorder journey. All of my flying geese in these quilts are because geese use their voice to signal changes in seasons, much like my voice did the same thing. Every quilt though I've made, there's some story that goes behind it. Even if it's just a jelly roll quilt, there was something that inspired me to make it. I enjoy every part. And even though we joke that I don't like to bind, I actually don't. I like quilts once they're bound. They look really nice. I get hung up because I don't like putting the binding on the quilt. Once it's on, I usually create about getting it finished. It's getting it from binding strips onto the quilt. I really enjoy the whole process. There's something about designing the quilt, picking out the fabric, cutting it, seeing those cut pieces become blocks, seeing the blocks become a quilt top, seeing the quilt top with borders, putting on the long arm and getting it done. There's just something exciting about watching that whole creation come from this big kind of explosion of stuff into a very confined finished project. So favorite designs, I've always loved sampler quilts. So some of my samplers are my favorite samplers. Obviously Illusions, I did one for Nebraska Statehood, their 150th anniversary in 2017. I did a special quilt for that project. And that was when that was a Saturday sampler at the store. We had 70 some students make the quilt. And I wrote a history lesson for each block. It was really a lot of fun. I did one a year ago for a hymn festival that all the blocks were based on biblical quilt blocks and their stories. Hopefully someday I'll write that into a pattern. People are asking for it. I'm just not, there's some other things I want to do to that one first before I can go that far. And then of course my Star Wars quilt is one of my pride and joys because I'm a nerd. My college buddy and I both have a big thing for Star Wars, so we each have one. You know, I think all the quilts give me some sort of excitement, inspiration, because it's when I get the email back from someone or a Facebook message or a Facebook post, oh, look at my colorway, and people are really excited about it. That's where I'm like, oh, I made a good quilt. And I can't think of a quilt that I've ever done. Yes, there's one quilt that I don't like. There's only one quilt that I've ever designed for a magazine that I absolutely dislike it to no end. But all the other quilts, I get so much excitement from when seeing people do with the projects. I have one quilt that my grandmother did with shirts that my mom made me as a kid. That's in the basement. And I have one log cabin quilt that she and I did together. She got Alzheimer's about the time that I actually got into quilting, and I was the first person she forgot. And so I do not have a quilt specifically from her that she made. Mom asked her to make the t-shirt, or it's not a t-shirt, the shirt one, and the other log cabin we did together. But I got the memories of sewing with her as a kid. So my Illusions quilt. So my initial Illusions quilt was something that I usually have the quilt designed before I ever go get fabric. And in the case of this quilt, we got a bolt of fabric in from Moda Zen Chic called trigonometry. And originally when I went to college, I wanted to be an architect. And then I got to college, they said, you can take calculus and physics. I'm like, I'm not that intelligent. Became a business major. But I still love architecture. And I saw this trigonometry fabric. I'm like, this is so cool. I went to my coworker, I'm like, I want the entire bolt. All 15 yards. Don't cut a fat quarter off it. I want the entire 15-yard bolt. She goes, what are you going to do? I'm like, I have no clue. And I bought 24 grunge fat quarters. And I said, I'm going to design a sampler quilt that's a modern take on a traditional sampler. And I designed my original Illusions. A friend of mine, Nancy McNally, custom quilted for me as a gift. And that day was August of 2018, and I won first place at the state fair. Not grand prize, but first place in that division. And that was a pretty big deal because I was also in the middle of my voice disorder right before I was going in for surgery. So to have that high during a lot of turmoil in my life was really good. So I do design usually once a year, kind of depends on the year. I do a special quilt that is designed for Dysphonia International fundraiser. My voice disorder is called spasmodic dysphonia. Dysphonia International is the national organization for it. And ever since my diagnosis in 2017, I've done a yearly fundraiser of some sort. So for 3 of the years, I did a quilt based on flying geese for the fundraiser. If people donated, I sent them a free copy of the pattern. So the very first year was Birds of a Feather. And then another year was Changes in Season 3. And then my favorite collection, Quilting is My Voice, was a fundraiser in 2023 for that organization as well. Okay, so For years, I lived in a 900 square foot apartment, studio loft. So it was one room. They had the bedroom, the kitchen, the living room, the sewing room, everything in one space. And I created. When I got my home that I'm living in now, when we were house hunting, I said, I really want a good, dedicated sewing space. And again, this was not a career. So the where I'm at in my business now, where my business was when we bought the house, was not in sync with each other. So I said, but I knew when I got to my creative space, I wanted a big cutting table, a big ironing station, and a spot to hold my fabric, and a long arm space. And this house, when we toured the house, had all those features. Now, I will say, we bought this house 3 days after I had major surgery. I actually do not remember touring the house. The only thing I remember, as I said, my piano could live there, and saying we should make an offer in the basement. That is the extent of what I remember of the house tour when we bought the house. But my creative space is definitely organized. My creative space is, my friends make fun of me because it never looks used or sewn in. It has to be very, very pristine organized. If it's not, I won't go down there and create. It's who I am. I mean, quilting has always been just a hobby. It was, again, never supposed to be where I'm at today. But I can tell you, quilting got me through the darkest part of my life. When my voice went to hell and I didn't know what I was doing, I was ready to quit the store. I was ready to quit a lot of things. And my boss, my customers, my students were like, no, they're like, just show up. We'll figure it out. And so they never gave me that opportunity to take the easy option out. They forced me to find workarounds. So I taught classes with PowerPoints. I taught classes with a dry erase board, writing my entire lesson down. So the quilting has really got me through those dark days where I didn't know what was going on. It gave me that focus and support that I needed. Okay, so this is my living room. And here is my Nebraska The Good Life quilt. This was a 12-part sampler I did at the store years ago. So we have the Nebraska block, the woolly mammoth, 2 canoes for Lewis and Clark going across Nebraska, the Sandhill cranes, got a little bit of Nebraska football. Pony Express came through Nebraska, Indian Plumes block, Chimney Rock. We have the Lincoln Highway and I-80. Lincoln Highway came right up Main Street. Fremont, there's a couple more blocks down below, and then also the log cabins for all the pioneers across the state. So this was the very first quilt I ever made at the age of 7. Grandma taught me how to rotary cut at the age of 7. I do not recommend letting a 7-year-old use a rotary cutter, but I rotary cut the borders, I pieced them, I pressed them, and then she tied it. This hung in a quilt show that summer, and I got sick with really bad tonsillitis the weekend of the show, and so I couldn't go see it. But my grandmother sat outside the room the whole weekend and took notes of people's comments. So when she came to watch me when Mom and Dad went back to work, she could read me the comments. And there's the label that she made for it in her handwriting. So this is the original Illusion sampler. It's 88 by 112, and I actually specifically looked for a spot in the house that this would fit when we bought houses. So thankfully my parents were paying attention when we toured it. I use a very sophisticated hanging system, command hooks and binder clips to hold it on the wall. So here is the famous Moose to Be quilting sampler with our big Moose Max in the center, surrounded by 12 little moose and all their blocks, done on Maywood Woolies flannel. This is the most softest, luxurious quilt ever. On the bed is Andromeda sampler. This is done out of my first collection with Banyan Batiks. I wanted something that was bright and cheerful and just a wall of color. So that's where this one came from. And since the collection was called Quilter's Guide to the Galaxy, I played up the galaxy theme, and every quilt in this collection had some sort of space galaxy name, so hence Andromeda sampler after the Andromeda galaxy. And then on the wall is my prized Star Wars quilt. My dad has a laser cutter in their basement, so he laser cut all the applique for me. I did approach this a little bit different than most people would approach applique. I actually pieced the quilt, quilted it, and bound it before I ever put any of the applique on. And that was to keep it from getting puckers and ripples when I was doing these really large letters. But that meant I had to turn the entire quilt, batting, backing, the entire thing to go around all the different silhouettes through the art of my machine. Every summer from May to Labor Day, I do a free quilt along on my Facebook page and on my website, 4th and Main Designs. And it usually goes from Memorial Day to Labor Day. This year, because of some stuff going on in my life, we're starting May 5th. The quilt is called City Square. You can go onto Facebook or my webpage, look up Summer Quilt Along, get your yardage, so you can start planning your colorway to make the quilt to quilt along. This is where all the magic happens for 4th and Main Designs. This is my sewing corner. I'm kind of back walking to a corner, but I've got a nice big table with my machine and my huge design wall that I can work off of right behind me. From there, I can get up, walk over to one of my big cutting stations. This was a priority when I built this, when I redid the basement. It's 48 by 92, so I've got a lot of workspace there to cut borders to size, to lay stuff out, stage stuff. The other thing I wanted was a big ironing board. I hate having to press borders on a small ironing board where the fabric slips off. So this is a 96-inch ironing board. And then kind of my wall of fun quilts that have been gifts. This was when I was president of the Quilt Guild. This was a competition I did for FOF, for my friend Stacy, for my friend Jenny, for my friend Lisa, for my friend Luann. Just kind of some fun stuff there. My grandfather, Dan Flanagan, loved to do woodworking, so this is his pig in a blanket. So I kind of felt that was fitting for the basement. Then we've got my long arm area and what I affectionately call the vault, with about 500 of the quilts. There's more quilts stored underneath the long arm, and that doesn't count the ones that are out traveling and in other locations. Then underneath the cutting table on this side, this is all contracted projects I need to work on for books, magazines, future block of the month, etc. Then we have white totes, which are batik sorted by color, and like my Halloween, my sewing, my Kona Solid, my grunge. My advanced bolts of my 2 collections that are out being shown right now. Changes in Seasons and Celebrating 250. Red totes are printed cotton sorted by color. And then underneath this side is all scrap fabric that my friends are all welcome to raid whenever they're here, sorted by color. And lastly, we have the last little bit of our cutting space, which is my large Martelli table. I love this because since I'm tall, this is comfortable for me to stand and work at. And then my serger spot and another small table I can keep a backup sewing machine. Thanks for coming and visiting me in my studio today and touring my house and hearing a little bit about my journey in the quilt world. As we finish up, I've got 2 words of advice that I tell at the beginning of every one of my lectures for guilds and shops. 1, a project is only hard if someone tells you it's hard before you begin. And 2, you learn some of the best lessons from mistakes you make along the way. And I've always lived by those 2 rules, and they've never failed me yet.